Mrs. Louise Carter, a 78-year-old black woman, had faced her fair share of challenges in life. But nothing could have prepared her for the humiliation she was about to endure on what should have been a routine trip to the grocery store. With her husband bedridden at home, now dependent on her care, Mrs. Louise found herself in the unenviable position of purchasing adult diapers. As she approached the checkout, her heart racing with anxiety, she couldn't have known that a police officer in line behind her was about to turn her simple errand into a public spectacle of cruel jokes and mockery. In that moment of humiliation, when all seemed lost, an unexpected hero emerged. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and if you enjoy this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the worn, faded curtains of Mrs. Louise's modest living room. At 78 years old, she moved with a deliberate slowness, her joints creaking in protest as she prepared for her weekly trip to the grocery store. She stood before a small mirror, adjusting her practical, faded dress, a relic from a time when things were different, when life hadn't yet dealt its harshest blows. Mrs. Louise's gaze drifted to the crumpled piece of paper in her hand, a shopping list scrawled in shaky handwriting. Her eyes lingered on the last item, adult diapers. A familiar weight settled in her chest, a mixture of dread and resignation that had become as much a part of her routine as the shopping itself. She turned, her eyes falling on the figure of her husband, Mr. Carter, lying motionless in the bed that now dominated their living room. Once a proud soldier, strong and vibrant, he now lay trapped in a body that had betrayed him. A spinal cord injury during his service had left him partially paralyzed, dependent on round-the-clock care that Mrs. Louise provided with unwavering devotion. Beside the bed, a nightstand held the necessities of their new life, a bottle of medication, a half-empty glass of water, and a pack of adult diapers. Mrs. Louise's eyes lingered on the diapers, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions, love, duty, exhaustion, and a flicker of something deeper, more painful. She approached the bed, her steps slow and measured. "I'm heading to the store now, Carter," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of decades of companionship. Mr. Carter's eyes, still sharp and alert despite his immobile body, met hers. He couldn't speak, but his gaze conveyed a depth of emotion that words could never capture. Gratitude, love, and a profound sadness for the burden he had become. Mrs. Louise leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I won't be long," she promised, her hand lingering on his cheek for a moment, before she straightened up, wincing slightly at the protest in her back. As she gathered her worn purse and the reusable shopping bags that had seen better days, Mrs. Louise paused at the door. The thought of the trip ahead, of the looks she might receive, of the whispers and stares, made her want to retreat back into the safety of their home. But the need was real, and Carter depended on her. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and opened the door. The weight of responsibility settled around her like a familiar, if unwelcome, cloak as she stepped out into the world, leaving the sanctuary of their home behind. The bell above the door chimed softly as Mrs. Louise entered Simmons' grocery, a fixture in their small town for as long as anyone could remember. The store, with its narrow aisles and slightly musty smell, was a testament to a bygone era, much like Mrs. Louise herself. She nodded politely at the cashier behind the counter, a young man whose indifferent gaze barely registered her presence. Mrs. Louise was used to this invisibility. It came with age, she supposed, a gradual fading from the world's notice. Her steps were slow, partly due to the arthritis that had taken up residence in her knees, but also from a desire to remain unnoticed. She knew the layout of the store by heart, could navigate its aisles with her eyes closed if need be. But today, as always, her path to the hygiene aisle felt like a walk of shame. As she approached the dreaded section, Mrs. Louise's eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone was watching. The store was relatively empty at this hour, just a few other early morning shoppers going about their business. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, judged. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pack of adult diapers. The plastic crinkled loudly in the quiet aisle, and Mrs. Louise winced, sure that the sound would draw attention. She quickly clutched the package to her chest, as if hiding it could somehow erase its existence or the need for it. The weight of the package in her arms was nothing compared to the weight in her heart. Each step towards the checkout felt like an eternity, a gauntlet of imagined stares and whispers. She kept her eyes down, avoiding contact with the few other shoppers she passed. As she neared the front of the store, Mrs. Louise allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Soon, this part would be over. Soon, she could return to the safety of home, to Carter, where the outside world and its judgments couldn't reach them. But as she approached the checkout line, a knot formed in her stomach. There were more people here waiting in line, idly chatting. Mrs. Louise took her place at the end of the line, her arms tightening around the package she carried, wishing she could disappear into the worn linoleum floor beneath her feet. The line inched forward slowly, each moment an exercise in vulnerability. Mrs. Louise kept her gaze fixed on the floor, counting the scuff marks on the tiles, anything to avoid meeting the eyes of those around her. She was so close now, just a few more minutes and she could escape. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Mrs. Louise neared the front of the line, a booming voice cut through the quiet murmur of the store, shattering her hope for an unremarkable exit. The voice belonged to a police officer, his uniform crisp and authoritative, standing just a few places behind Mrs. Louise in line. He was chatting amicably with another customer, his voice carrying easily in the confined space of the store. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" the officer was saying, his tone jovial. Nothing like a bit of sunshine to start the day right. Mrs. Louise tensed, her grip on the package tightening. She could feel the officer's presence behind her, an unwelcome reminder of the world beyond her small, carefully managed existence. As she inched closer to the checkout counter, Mrs. Louise became acutely aware of the package in her arms. She tried to angle her body, to hide it from view, but the crinkling of the plastic seemed to echo in her ears with every movement. Suddenly, the officer's voice cut through her thoughts again, this time with a different tone. "Would you look at that?" he said, his voice lowered but still clearly audible. "Buying diapers at her age. Must be for her. Poor thing can't even take care of herself." The words hit Mrs. Louise like a physical blow. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The shame she had been holding at bay came crashing over her in a suffocating wave. Around her, she could hear quiet snickers, could feel the weight of curious glances. The line, which had seemed interminable before, now felt like an endless walk of humiliation. Mrs. Louise's hands trembled as she placed the diapers on the counter, her face flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't bring herself to look up, couldn't bear to see the pity or disgust she was sure would be reflected in the eyes of those around her. The young cashier, a man with a name tag that read Isaac, stood silently behind the register. If he had any thoughts about the situation unfolding before him, his face didn't betray them. His expression remained neutral, his movements efficient as he began to scan Mrs. Louise's items. As the beep of the scanner punctuated the tense atmosphere, Mrs. Louise found herself wishing for the ability to disappear. Each second felt like an eternity, each breath a struggle against the tears that threatened to spill over. The tension in the store had reached a fever pitch. Mrs. Louise stood at the checkout counter, her body rigid with humiliation, as the police officer's mocking words hung in the air. The diapers sat on the conveyor belt, a stark reminder of the vulnerability that had brought her to this moment. "That's what happens when you get old," the officer continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure that more people could hear. "You start acting like a baby again." The cruel laughter that followed his words cut through Mrs. Louise like a knife. She could feel the eyes of other customers on her, some whispering behind their hands, others staring openly with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Mrs. Louise's hands gripped the handle of her cart so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She desperately wanted to defend herself, to explain about Carter, about the sacrifices they had both made, about the love that sustained them through each difficult day. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat tightened, choking back the explanation, the plea for understanding that she longed to voice. For a moment, she considered leaving the store without the diapers. The thought of walking away, of escaping the suffocating atmosphere of judgment and mockery, was almost overwhelming in its appeal. But the image of Carter at home, dependent on her care, flashed through her mind. She couldn't leave. She had to endure this for him. So Mrs. Louise stood there, silent and trembling, her eyes lowered to avoid meeting the gaze of anyone around her. She focused on the scuffed linoleum floor, counting the tiles, trying to steady her breathing, willing herself to become invisible. The young cashier, Isaac, continued to scan her items, his movements methodical and unhurried. If he was aware of the drama unfolding around him, his face didn't show it. But his eyes, when they briefly met Mrs. Louise's, held a flicker of something. Concern, perhaps, or a growing unease with the situation. The officer, emboldened by the lack of resistance to his comments, decided to push further. His voice carried clearly across the store as he added, with a cruel laugh, "Maybe they should have a special line for people who need diapers. Keep 'em out of the way of the rest of us." This latest barb sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the onlookers. Some laughed nervously, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady beep of the scanner as Isaac continued his work. Mrs. Louise felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice. The humiliation threatened to overwhelm her, to break the carefully constructed walls of dignity she had built around herself over years of caring for Carter. She could feel tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in front of these strangers. In that moment of utter desolation, Mrs. Louise's mind wandered to Carter at home. She thought of his strength, of the dignity he maintained even in the face of his debilitating injury. She drew on that strength now, pulling it around herself like a shield. Still, she remained silent. Years of experience had taught her that speaking up often made things worse, that silence was sometimes the only defense against cruelty. So she stood there, a pillar of quiet resilience in the face of public humiliation, waiting for the moment to pass. The air in the store was thick with tension, everyone seeming to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would anyone intervene? Would the officer's cruelty go unchallenged? As Isaac scanned the last of her items, Mrs. Louise finally raised her eyes, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. In that brief moment of connection, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice unfolding, perhaps, or a shared moment of human understanding. And then, just as the situation seemed about to reach its breaking point, something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the tense silence, firm and clear, changing the course of events in an instant. "That's enough." The words, spoken with quiet authority, sliced through the tension-filled air of the store. Every head turned towards the source. Isaac, the young cashier who had been silently observing the unfolding drama. The store fell into a shocked silence. Customers who had been whispering now froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The police officer, caught off guard by this unexpected challenge, stood with his mouth slightly agape, the mocking smile fading from his face. Isaac's eyes, which had remained downcast throughout most of the interaction, now met the officer's gaze steadily. There was no hint of the timid store clerk in his demeanor now. Instead, he radiated a quiet strength, a resolve that seemed to grow with each passing second. Turning to Mrs. Louise, Isaac's voice softened, filled with a respect that was in stark contrast to the mockery she had endured. "You don't deserve to be treated like this," he said, his words carrying clearly in the hushed store. Mrs. Louise stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise and a glimmer of something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or the stirring of long-buried hope. For a moment she forgot about the prying eyes around her, focused solely on this unexpected ally. Isaac then faced the officer directly, his voice firm but controlled. "You should be ashamed of yourself for mocking her," he said, each word deliberate and weighted with conviction. The police officer, visibly stunned by this turn of events, opened his mouth to respond. But something in Isaac's unwavering gaze caused him to hesitate. The authority he had wielded so carelessly moments ago seemed to waver in the face of this young man's moral stand. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken tensions. Other customers watched the scene with a mixture of awe and discomfort, unsure of how to react to this unexpected confrontation between a lowly store clerk and a uniformed officer of the law. Mrs. Louise stood frozen, her hands still gripping her cart, hardly daring to breathe. She had come to the store expecting, at best, indifference. To be defended so openly, so passionately, was beyond anything she could have imagined. As the standoff continued, the atmosphere in the store began to shift. Whispers started up again, but this time they were tinged with a different emotion. Some customers nodded approvingly at Isaac, while others cast disapproving glances at the officer. The officer, his face now flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, crossed his arms defensively. "You can't talk to me like that," he sputtered, trying to regain his authoritative stance. "Do you know who I am?" Isaac didn't flinch. His voice remained calm but firm as he replied, "I know exactly who you are. You're someone who should be protecting and serving the community, not bullying its most vulnerable members." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. It was rare to see anyone, let alone a young store clerk, stand up to a police officer in such a manner. Mrs. Louise, still rooted to the spot, felt a warm rush of emotion. Tears pricked at her eyes again. But this time they weren't from shame or humiliation. For the first time in what felt like ages, she felt seen, truly seen, as a person worthy of respect and dignity. The officer, clearly unused to being challenged, especially by someone he perceived as beneath his station, struggled to formulate a response. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. In the tense silence that followed, the sound of approaching footsteps drew everyone's attention. The store manager, a middle-aged man with a nervous energy about him, hurried towards the scene. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, his voice strained as he looked between the officer, Isaac, and Mrs. Louise. His eyes darted nervously from one face to another, clearly aware of the tension but unsure of its source. The officer, seizing the opportunity to reassert his authority, spoke up first. His voice was filled with indignation as he pointed an accusing finger at Isaac. "You need to control your staff," he declared. "This one here decided to insult me in front of the whole store. If this is how you let your employees behave, I won't be coming back here again." The manager's face paled visibly at the threat. He stammered slightly. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." His gaze flickered uncertainly between the officer and Isaac, the conflict between keeping an important customer happy and supporting his employee clear on his face. Before the manager could continue, the officer waved his hand dismissively. "Forget it," he snapped. "I'll make sure everyone knows how this store treats its customers." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the store, throwing one last glare at Isaac as he left. In the wake of the officer's dramatic exit, a heavy silence fell over the store. The manager stood frozen for a moment, watching the officer leave, before slowly turning back to face Isaac and Mrs. Louise. The conflict was written clearly on his face, relief at the officer's departure, warring with concern over the potential consequences of the confrontation. Mrs. Louise, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly felt the weight of the situation. She had come here for a simple errand, and now she found herself at the center of a storm. Guilt washed over her as she realized that Isaac might face repercussions for defending her. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice quavering slightly. "I never meant to cause any trouble." Isaac turned to her, his face softening. "You have nothing to apologize for, ma'am," he said gently. "You did nothing wrong." The manager, seeming to remember himself, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Louise," he said, his voice taking on a placating tone, "please finish your shopping. Your items are on the house today." Mrs. Louise opened her mouth to protest, but the manager held up a hand. "I insist," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As Mrs. Louise gathered her bags, including the package of adult diapers that had sparked the entire incident, she couldn't help but notice the tense exchange of looks between Isaac and the manager. A knot formed in her stomach as she realized that this incident was far from over. With a last grateful look at Isaac, Mrs. Louise made her way out of the store. The sunlight outside seemed harsh after the fluorescent lighting of the store, and she blinked rapidly, trying to adjust. As she began her walk home, her mind whirled with the events of the morning. The humiliation she had felt earlier had been replaced by a complex mix of emotions: gratitude towards Isaac, worry about the consequences he might face, and a lingering sense of shame that her presence had caused such a disturbance. As she walked, clutching her bags close, Mrs. Louise found herself hoping that she would see Isaac again, if only to properly thank him for his kindness. Little did she know that fate had much more in store for both of them. The familiar sight of her modest home came into view, and Mrs. Louise felt a wave of relief wash over her. She climbed the few steps to her porch, each one a reminder of the day's ordeal, and fumbled with her keys to unlock the door. Once inside, Mrs. Louise took a moment to catch her breath. She set her bags down gently by the door and made her way to the living room, where Mr. Carter's hospital bed occupied a central space. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. With a soft sigh, she settled into her favorite armchair, positioned next to Mr. Carter's bed. Her hands folded in her lap as she turned to her husband, ready to recount the day's events. "Oh, Carter," she sighed, her voice tinged with a mixture of emotions. "You wouldn't believe what happened at the store today." Mr. Carter's eyes, still sharp and alert despite his immobile body, focused on her intently. Though he couldn't speak, years of marriage had given them a way of communicating that transcended words. His gaze encouraged her to continue, filled with curiosity and concern. Mrs. Louise leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering as if she were sharing a secret. "There was this young man at the checkout," she began, "a cashier named Isaac. He stood up for me, Carter. When everyone else was silent, when that officer was mocking me, Isaac spoke up." As she detailed the confrontation, Mrs. Louise's voice trembled with remembered emotion. She described Isaac's quiet strength, the way he had faced down the officer without hesitation. "It was like he saw me, Carter," she said softly. "Not just an old woman buying things we need, but me. A person." Mr. Carter's eyes softened, a look of understanding passing between them. They had both faced their share of prejudice and dismissal over the years, and they knew the rare and precious value of being truly seen. As night fell and the room grew dark, Mrs. Louise found herself unable to stop thinking about Isaac. Who was he? Why had he felt compelled to step in when no one else would? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered but persistent. "I hope he's all right," she murmured, more to herself than to Carter. "I hope he didn't get into trouble because of me." She reached out, taking Mr. Carter's hand in hers. His fingers twitched slightly in response, a small movement that meant the world to her. "We've been through so much, haven't we?" she said softly, her voice filled with a lifetime of shared experiences. As she sat there, holding her husband's hand in the quiet of their home, Mrs. Louise reflected on how much their lives had changed. She thought of Carter in his days as a soldier, strong, independent, full of life. And now here they were, dependent on each other in ways they never could have imagined. Despite everything, as she looked at her husband's face, lined with age but still so dear to her, Mrs. Louise felt a surge of love and gratitude. Yes, their life was hard. Yes, there were days when the burden seemed almost too much to bear, but they had each other, and that was no small thing. And now there was Isaac, a stranger who had shown kindness when it was least expected. As Mrs. Louise prepared for bed that night, she felt a small flame of hope flickering in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seemed. Little did she know that this encounter, brief as it was, would lead to changes she could never have anticipated. As she drifted off to sleep, her hand still entwined with Carter's, the wheels of fate were already in motion, setting the stage for what was to come. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of the previous day. Mrs. Louise woke early, as was her habit, and went about her morning routine with a sense of purpose. As she helped Carter with his medication and morning care, her mind kept drifting back to Isaac and his unexpected act of kindness. "I think I'll go back to the store today, Carter," she said as she tidied up the living room. "I want to thank that young man properly. Maybe bring him some of those oatmeal cookies you used to love so much." Mr. Carter's eyes crinkled at the corners, his version of a smile. Mrs. Louise patted his hand gently before heading to the kitchen to bake. An hour later, with a small container of freshly baked cookies in hand, Mrs. Louise made her way back to Simmons' grocery. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and she found herself scanning the checkout lanes, looking for Isaac's familiar face. But Isaac wasn't there. Frowning slightly, Mrs. Louise approached another employee, a young woman arranging a display near the front of the store. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'm looking for Isaac, the young man who was working the checkout yesterday." The employee looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Oh, Mrs. Louise," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. I'm not sure where Isaac is. He didn't show up for his shift today." A knot of unease formed in Mrs. Louise's stomach. "He didn't show up?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The employee shook her head, looking uncomfortable. "No, ma'am, it's not like him to miss work without calling. I don't know any more than that. I'm sorry I can't be of more help." Mrs. Louise thanked the employee absently, her mind whirling with possibilities. Had Isaac gotten into trouble because of her? Had standing up to the officer cost him his job? The guilt she had felt yesterday came rushing back, intensified by worry. As she left the store, the container of cookies still clutched in her hands, Mrs. Louise felt a deep sense of unease. Isaac's absence seemed strange, especially after what had happened the day before. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Walking home, her steps slower and heavier than usual, Mrs. Louise found herself scanning the streets, half hoping to catch a glimpse of Isaac. But the familiar faces she saw were not the ones she was looking for. When she arrived home, she sank into her chair next to Carter's bed with a heavy sigh. "He wasn't there, Carter," she said softly. "Isaac. He didn't come to work today. No one knows where he is." Mr. Carter's brow furrowed slightly, concern evident in his eyes. Mrs. Louise reached out to take his hand, drawing comfort from the familiar touch. "I can't help but worry," she continued. "What if he lost his job because of me? What if—" She trailed off, unable to voice the myriad of concerns swirling in her mind. As the day wore on, Mrs. Louise found herself unable to shake her concern for Isaac. She went about her usual tasks, caring for Carter, preparing meals, tidying the house, but her thoughts kept returning to the young man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep eluding her, Mrs. Louise made a decision. She would go back to the store tomorrow, and the day after if necessary. She would find out what had happened to Isaac. It was the least she could do for someone who had risked so much to defend her dignity. Little did Mrs. Louise know that her path and Isaac's were about to intersect again, in a way that would change both their lives forever. Several days passed, each one marked by Mrs. Louise's increasingly worried visits to the grocery store. Each time, she was met with the same response. Isaac hadn't returned to work, and no one seemed to know where he was. The manager, when she finally managed to speak with him, was evasive, muttering about personnel matters and company policy. It was on a particularly warm afternoon, almost a week after the incident at the store, that fate intervened. Mrs. Louise had decided to take a different route home, her feet carrying her through the modest shopping district of their small town. The streets were busier than usual, filled with people enjoying the pleasant weather. As she walked, lost in thought, a figure on the sidewalk ahead caught her eye. A man was sitting with his back against a building, a small cardboard sign propped up in front of him. There was something familiar about the slump of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. Mrs. Louise's steps slowed as she approached, her heart beginning to race as recognition dawned. The man was wearing a weathered jacket, his clothes rumpled and dirty, but there was no mistaking his face. "It's you," she breathed, coming to a stop in front of him. "Isaac." The young man looked up, his eyes hollow but widening in recognition. "Mrs. Louise?" he said, his voice hoarse. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the busy street fading into the background. Then, almost in unison, they both began to speak. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Louise asked, her voice filled with concern. At the same time, Isaac said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't want you to see me like this." There was a beat of silence, and then Mrs. Louise lowered herself carefully to sit on the curb next to Isaac, her joints protesting the movement, but her determination overriding her discomfort. "What happened?" she asked gently, her eyes taking in Isaac's disheveled appearance, the dark circles under his eyes. Isaac sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I got fired," he said simply. "After what happened. The manager said there were complaints from some of the customers about what I said. He said it was bad for business." Mrs. Louise felt as if she'd been struck. "Fired? For standing up for me?" The guilt that had been simmering inside her for days bubbled to the surface. "Oh, Isaac, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." Isaac shook his head firmly. "No, Mrs. Louise, it's not your fault at all. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. What that officer did, it wasn't right. Someone had to say something." Mrs. Louise felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "But your job, your life." Isaac's laugh was hollow. "Truth is, Mrs. Louise, losing that job was just the final straw. I've been struggling for a while now." As they sat there on the sidewalk, oblivious to the curious glances of passers-by, Isaac began to share his story. Mrs. Louise listened, her heart breaking for this young man who had shown her such kindness. Isaac's story unfolded slowly, each word seeming to cost him effort, as if he were unaccustomed to sharing his burdens. Mrs. Louise listened intently, her weathered hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture of support. "I was a soldier once," Isaac began, his eyes focused on some distant point. "Served overseas. I thought I was doing something good, you know, protecting people, serving my country." Mrs. Louise nodded, thinking of her own Carter and the pride he had taken in his service. "It's a noble calling," she said softly. Isaac's smile was bitter. "Maybe, but it comes at a cost." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "While I was deployed, my wife, she cheated on me. Said she couldn't handle the distance, the uncertainty. When I came back, I found divorce papers waiting for me." Mrs. Louise's grip on Isaac's arm tightened slightly, a silent show of support. She could see the pain etched in the lines of his face, hear it in the tremor of his voice. "I thought I could handle it, you know," Isaac continued. "Thought I was stronger than that. But the betrayal, it broke something in me. I started drinking, just to numb the pain at first, but soon—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I couldn't hold down a job, lost my apartment. The part-time gig at the grocery store was all I had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover food and—" He hesitated, shame coloring his words. "And my habit. I was staying at a cheap motel, but now—" Mrs. Louise felt her heart constrict. This young man, who had shown such strength in standing up for her, had been carrying such a heavy burden. "Oh, Isaac," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Isaac looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "When I saw that officer humiliating you, something just snapped. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Not again. Not to someone who didn't deserve it." The weight of Isaac's words hung in the air between them. Mrs. Louise felt a surge of emotions, gratitude for his kindness, sorrow for his struggles, and a growing sense of determination. "Isaac," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth, "what you did for me, it meant more than you could know. You gave me back my dignity when others were trying to take it away." Isaac smiled weakly, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "I'm glad I could help, Mrs. Louise, even if it cost me everything else." Mrs. Louise straightened her back, decision crystallizing in her mind. Not everything, Isaac. Not if I have anything to say about it. She stood up, her joints creaking in protest, and held out her hand to Isaac. Come with me. I insist you join me for a meal. Isaac hesitated, embarrassment clouding his features. Mrs. Louise, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to be a burden. Nonsense, Mrs. Louise said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. You stood up for me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to stand up for you. After a moment's pause, Isaac took her outstretched hand, allowing her to help him to his feet. Together they made their way to a small cafe nearby, drawing curious glances from passers-by. The cafe was a cozy establishment, tucked away on a quiet corner. As they settled into a booth near the back, Mrs. Louise couldn't help but notice Isaac's discomfort. His eyes darted around nervously, and he seemed to shrink into himself as if trying to become invisible. Order whatever you like, dear, Mrs. Louise said gently, pushing the menu towards him. Don't you worry about a thing. Isaac's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the menu. Mrs. Louise, I don't know what to say. You don't have to do this. Mrs. Louise reached across the table, patting his hand reassuringly. I want to, Isaac. Now tell me more about yourself. Where did you serve? As they waited for their food, Isaac slowly began to open up. He told her about his time in the army, the friends he'd made, the hardships he'd endured. Mrs. Louise listened attentively, her heart aching for the young man who had seen so much pain in his short life. You know, she said softly as their meals arrived, my Carter was a soldier too. He served in Vietnam. Isaac looked up, interest flickering in his eyes. Really? What branch? Army, just like you, Mrs. Louise replied, a fond smile playing on her lips. He was so proud to serve his country, but... Her voice faltered slightly. He paid a heavy price for it. Sensing her emotion, Isaac leaned forward slightly. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? Mrs. Louise took a deep breath, steeling herself. She rarely spoke about Carter's condition to others, but something about Isaac's earnest gaze made her want to share. It was during his second tour, she began. There was an accident, a spinal cord injury. The doctors, they did what they could, but Carter was left partially paralyzed. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. Over the years it's gotten worse. Now he needs constant care. That's why I was buying those diapers at the store. Understanding dawned in Isaac's eyes. Mrs. Louise, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. She shook her head, a small smile gracing her features. Don't be sorry, dear. Carter and I, we've had a good life together. It's not the one we planned, but it's ours. We face each day together, and that's what matters. As they continued to talk, a bond began to form between them. Isaac shared more about his struggles with addiction and homelessness, while Mrs. Louise spoke of the challenges of being a full-time caregiver. Despite the vast differences in their ages and experiences, they found common ground in their shared experiences of hardship and resilience. As the meal came to an end, Mrs. Louise made a decision. Isaac, she said, her voice firm but kind, I want you to come home with me. Meet Carter. We have a spare room, and I think we could help each other. Isaac's eyes widened in surprise. Mrs. Louise, I couldn't possibly. You've already done so much. Nonsense, she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. You need a place to stay, and frankly, I could use an extra pair of hands around the house. It's not charity, Isaac. It's what decent folks do for each other. For a moment, Isaac was silent, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Then, slowly, he nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Louise. I don't know what to say. Mrs. Louise smiled, reaching out to pat his hand once more. You don't have to say anything, dear. Just come home with me. Let's see where this new chapter takes us. As they left the cafe together, Mrs. Louise felt a warmth in her heart that had been absent for too long. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that somehow things were about to change for the better. As Mrs. Louise and Isaac made their way to her home, Mrs. Louise couldn't help but notice Isaac's nervousness. His eyes darted around, taking in the modest houses lining the street, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his worn jacket. "Now, don't you worry," she said softly, patting his arm. "Carter's a good man. He'll be glad to meet you." As they stepped inside, the familiar smell of home enveloped them, a mixture of lavender air freshener and the lingering aroma of Mrs. Louise's cooking. Isaac's eyes darted around, taking in the worn but well-maintained furniture, the family photos on the walls, and finally, the hospital bed in the corner of the living room where Mr. Carter lay. "Carter, dear," Mrs. Louise called out as they entered, "we have a visitor. This is Isaac, the young man I told you about." Mr. Carter's eyes, still sharp and alert despite his immobile body, focused on Isaac. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, to Mrs. Louise's surprise and delight, Isaac stepped forward, his posture straightening as if by instinct. "It's an honor to meet you, sir," he said, his voice carrying a respect that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. Mr. Carter's eyes crinkled at the corners, his version of a smile. Mrs. Louise felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched the two men begin to connect, Isaac pulling up a chair next to the bed, as Mr. Carter's eyes encouraged him to sit. As Isaac began to talk with Mr. Carter, sharing stories of his own time in the service, Mrs. Louise quietly slipped into the kitchen to prepare some tea. She couldn't quite explain it, but she felt as if something important was happening in her living room, something that might just change all their lives for the better. Little did she know just how right she was. In the days that followed, a remarkable transformation began to take place in the Carter household. Isaac, initially hesitant and unsure, quickly became an integral part of their daily routine. Mrs. Louise watched with joy as Isaac threw himself into helping around the house. He tackled repairs that had long been neglected, his hands growing steady with purpose. But it was Isaac's interactions with Mr. Carter that truly warmed Mrs. Louise's heart. The two men formed a bond that transcended words, with Isaac spending hours by Mr. Carter's bedside, reading or recounting stories from his time in the service. As weeks turned into months, Isaac's determination grew stronger. One evening, Mrs. Louise overheard him talking softly to Mr. Carter about getting help for his drinking problem. The support and understanding in Mr. Carter's eyes seemed to give Isaac the strength he needed to take that first step. Isaac began attending support group meetings and started therapy, working through his trauma and pain. With newfound determination, he also started job hunting, eventually securing a position as a maintenance technician at a local community center. He often shared his progress with Mr. Carter, whose eyes conveyed the fatherly pride and encouragement that his voice could not express. The change in Isaac was remarkable. The hollow-eyed young man who had sat on the street corner became a distant memory, replaced by a man who stood tall and approached each day with purpose. Mrs. Louise, too, found herself changed by Isaac's presence. The burden of caring for Mr. Carter now felt lighter, with Isaac always there to lend a hand. As for Mr. Carter, the sparkle returned to his eyes. Though his body remained unmoving, his spirit seemed to soar as he watched Isaac's progress. As time passed, Isaac became more than just a helper or a guest. He became the son that Mr. and Mrs. Carter had always wanted but were never able to have. The injury Mr. Carter sustained in the war had left them unable to conceive, a silent sorrow they had carried for years. Now, in this unexpected twist of fate, they found themselves with a grown son who brought new life and energy into their home. In their modest house, three souls found healing in each other. Mrs. Louise, once burdened by solitude and endless responsibilities, now found joy in nurturing a young man back to health and purpose. Mr. Carter, though physically constrained, discovered a new voice through Isaac, who translated his silent wisdom into action. And Isaac, once lost and alone, found not just a home but a purpose, his life transformed by the unconditional love and quiet strength of the elderly couple.